The one-room apartment in the South Bronx reeked of cheap coffee and leftovers from the night before. Julia Martinez woke up even before the alarm went off, her brown eyes burning from lack of sleep. At 32 years old, her face already showed the marks of a life of hard work, small wrinkles at the corners of her eyes, rough hands from chemicals, and a look that carried as much love as worry. The dim light of the November dawn filtered through the thin curtain, illuminating the small rent-controlled apartment she struggled monthly to keep. By her side, curled up in a tattered superhero-patterned blanket, slept Gabriel, her 3-year-old son, the only ray of sunshine in her solitary existence since the child's father disappeared upon learning of her pregnancy. Julia watched her son's angelic face for a few moments, memorizing every eyelash, every freckle, every curve of his round cheeks, as if fearing each goodbye might be the last. "Just a few more hours of sleep, my angel," Julia whispered, gently caressing the boy's dark, curly hair, so much like her own. Reluctantly, she rose from the bed they shared and walked silently to the tiny bathroom. The cracked mirror reflected the image of a woman aging prematurely, her shoulders already hunched from the weight of responsibilities she carried alone. She washed her face with cold water, not turning on the heater to save on the bill. As she brushed her teeth, her eyes scanned the bills meticulously stacked on the windowsill. Overdue rent, Gabriel's outstanding medical insurance, the utility company's final notice. The mental math she did every morning never added up to a positive number, no matter how much she worked, saved, or sacrificed. "Please, God, just one more month without emergencies," she silently prayed, a daily repeated plea. "Mummy," Gabriel's sleepy voice echoed through the apartment. Julia forced a smile onto her face before returning to the bedroom. She found her son sitting up in bed, rubbing his eyes with tiny, balled fists, his oversized Spider-Man pajamas, a thrift store find she had washed dozens of times to look almost new. "Good morning, my little hero," Julia replied with a cheerfulness she didn't feel, kneeling beside the bed. "Did you sleep well? Dream of beautiful things?" Gabriel nodded, his large brown eyes lighting up as he began describing an elaborate dream involving dinosaurs, spaceships, and chocolate ice cream, a fantastical mix that only a child's imagination could create. Julia listened attentively, nodding and reacting at the right moments while mentally organizing the day. Drop Gabriel off with Mrs. Margaret at 6:30. Take the subway to Westchester suburbia. Work at the Harrington mansion from 7 to 3. Rush to her second job at the neighborhood laundromat from 4 to 9. And then finally come back to pick up her son. "Mummy, can I take Captain today? I promise I'll take good care of him," Gabriel asked, holding a tattered stuffed bear, one eye missing and patches in the seams. The toy had been Julia's gift to him on his second birthday, bought with money she had saved for 3 months, penny by penny. "Of course you can, my love. Captain loves Mrs. Margaret too," Julia responded, helping her son change clothes. The jeans had a small patch on the knee but were clean and pressed. The red rocket-patterned t-shirt was Gabriel's pride, a gift from Mrs. Margaret last Christmas. Julia knew every piece of her son's limited wardrobe, every story behind each item, every moment of joy these small possessions brought. "Let's have a special breakfast today, okay?" Julia forced enthusiasm into her voice as she prepared the only meal she could offer, scrambled eggs with a slice of toast. For Gabriel, she cut half an apple into thin slices, artfully arranging them on the plate as if they were a rare delicacy. The boy ate with gusto, swinging his little legs on the high chair she had found abandoned on the sidewalk and lovingly restored. Julia only drank coffee, ignoring the pang of hunger she felt. "I'll eat something at work," she lied to herself, knowing she would only carry an apple and a peanut butter sandwich in her bag to last the entire day. Every penny saved was 1 penny closer to a better future for Gabriel. The clock on the wall read 6:15. "Time to go, my love," Julia announced, helping Gabriel into his coat, patched up several times but still functional against the New York chill. As she packed her son's small backpack, putting in a change of clothes, the stuffed bear, and a worn storybook he loved, Julia struggled against the guilt that consumed her daily. Other children have present mothers, she thought. Other children don't need to be dropped off with a 72-year-old woman before the sun even rises. Other children wake up with their mothers by their side, don't have to say goodbye to them while still sleepy, in the darkness before dawn. But what choice did she have? With no formal education beyond high school, no family to help, no support system besides kind Mrs. Margaret, Julia was trapped in a cycle of work and survival that seemed endless. "Margaret is waiting for you with those special pancakes you love," commented Julia, as they walked along the dimly lit hallway of the dilapidated building where they lived. The elevator, broken for months, forced them to descend 5 flights of stairs. Patiently, Julia walked at the pace of Gabriel's short legs, firmly holding his little hand, a gesture of both protection and connection, a physical reminder that, despite everything, they had each other. In the entrance lobby with broken tiles and peeling walls, the night doorman, Mr. Rodriguez, waved sleepily. "It's going to rain today, Mrs. Martinez. Take an umbrella," advised the elderly man, whose kindness was one of the small comforts in Julia's difficult life. 5 blocks separated them from the small apartment where Mrs. Margaret Thompson, an American widow of Irish descent who had once worked as a governess for the Harringtons decades ago, lived. The connection between the two women was born of this coincidence. When Julia mentioned in a job interview that she needed someone to care for her son, Sarah Harrington, the seemingly benevolent employer suggested her former governess, now retired. The relationship that developed between Julia, Gabriel, and the elderly woman was the closest thing to a family they had. Margaret charged only a fraction of what a daycare would cost, and more importantly, offered Gabriel the kind of loving and individualized attention that no institution could provide. For Gabriel, the elderly woman was like the grandmother he had never known. For Julia, she was the only person in the world she trusted with her most precious possession. "Good morning, my dears. Come in, come in. It's cold out there," Mrs. Margaret greeted them at the door of her modest but immaculately clean apartment. Despite the arthritis that twisted her fingers and the constant back pain that made her walk slightly hunched, the elderly woman radiated an energy and vitality that belied her advanced age. Her white hair was always perfectly arranged in a low bun, and her apartment smelled of cinnamon and baked apples. "Good morning, Mrs. Margaret," Julia greeted, gratitude evident in her voice. "Gabriel had breakfast but said he was saving room for your famous pancakes." The old woman smiled, already guiding the boy to the cozy kitchen. "And you, dear, did you have a proper breakfast?" she asked with that knowing look that always made Julia feel like a girl again. "Of course," lied Julia, avoiding the old woman's penetrating gaze. In the small entrance hall, bending down to say goodbye to Gabriel, Julia felt the familiar tightness in her heart, that physical ache of separation that never diminished, no matter how many times she went through it. "Be a good boy for Mrs. Margaret, okay? Mama will be back as soon as she can." Gabriel nodded solemnly, his big eyes already focused on the pancakes the old woman was starting to prepare. "I love you to the moon," said Julia, initiating her farewell ritual. "And back," Gabriel automatically completed, giving her a quick kiss before running to the kitchen. Julia watched him for a moment, etching the image of her happy and secure son into her mind before forcing herself to turn and leave. She had a long day ahead, cleaning up after people who would earn in a day what she earned in a month, listening to complaints about invisible stains and imaginary dust, being treated as invisible while she could by her employers, and in the end, there was still the laundry with its stifling heat and chemicals that left her hands burning. But she would do it all and more day after day for Gabriel, because in the end he was the reason every sacrifice was worth it. Upstairs in the Harrington mansion, while Julia silently cleaned the hallways of the first floor, Ryan Harrington locked himself in his luxurious bedroom, the closed blinds creating an artificial darkness even during the bright autumn day. At 26, a graduate in business administration from an elite university, the Harringtons' only son exhibited all the outward characteristics of success: designer clothes, a Swiss watch, and the latest model of cell phone in his hands. But his features told a different story. Deep circles marked his pale face, the days-old stubble denoted neglect, and his fingers trembled slightly as they swiped through the phone's screen, checking game results and betting lines for the next round of the NFL. Behind the closed mahogany door, away from his parents' disapproving gaze, Ryan was not the promising heir to a real estate fortune, but a desperate man sinking deeper and deeper into an abyss of debt and lies. Come on, I just need one win," Ryan muttered to himself, hunched over multiple screens displaying statistics, odds, and player profiles. Complex spreadsheets with meticulous calculations littered his work desk, a distorted application of his academic training. The room, once immaculately organized by Julia's impeccable service, now looked like a battlefield. Food scraps, empty energy drink cans, and crumpled papers bore witness to sleepless nights and uncontrolled anxiety. Ryan ran his fingers through his already thinning brown hair for his age, a nervous habit developed in recent months since his gambling started spiraling out of control. What had started as a casual pastime among college friends had morphed into an obsession, a ravenous monster consuming not only his financial resources, but also his mental health, his relationships, and now threatening his very physical safety. The phone screen lit up with a message that made his stomach clench. Final deadline today, midnight. $75,000. No extensions. It wasn't the first threat he'd received from Tony Castellano, an underground bookie with dangerous connections in New York's underworld, but it was certainly the most explicit. The implications were clear for Ryan. This was not a debt that could be ignored or postponed with empty promises. The week before, two men had approached him in the golf club's parking lot, offering a free demonstration of what would happen if he continued to procrastinate. The aches in his body still refreshed his memory whenever he took a deep breath, a constant reminder of the clock ticking against him. Ryan tossed the phone onto the bed and walked to the window, peeking through a slit in the blinds to observe the immaculate garden below, where his mother supervised the gardeners with the same precision and control she applied to every aspect of her privileged life. Sarah Harrington, with her perfectly dyed blonde hair and ever-present pearls around her neck, was the image of suburban sophistication. William Harrington, her father, was equally intimidating in his perfection. A successful executive, respected community member, generous donor to hand-picked civic causes. They had both built their lives on foundations of hard work, discipline, and appearances. Ryan knew with absolute certainty that his parents would never understand his addiction, not for lack of resources to help him, but for a fundamental inability to accept any failing or weakness in their only son. From a young age, Ryan had been groomed to be exceptional. Mediocrity was not tolerated in the Harrington family. Failure was unthinkable, and gambling away hundreds of thousands of dollars on football games, losing the inheritance generations had built, that wouldn't just be a disappointment, it would be an unforgivable betrayal of family values. "Ryan, are you in there?" His mother's voice echoed down the hallway, followed by firm knocks on the door. Ryan quickly closed the betting windows on his computer, replacing them with stock market graphs. "One moment, Mother," he replied, running his hands over his face and trying to compose himself. When he opened the door, he forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Sarah Harrington scrutinized him with the critical gaze that always made him feel like a specimen under a microscope. "You look dreadful," she observed bluntly. "Are you getting enough sleep?" "Those dark circles are unacceptable for Saturday's charity dinner." Ryan swallowed the acidic response that rose in his throat. Even on the brink of financial and possibly physical ruin, his appearance at the charity event was still his mother's primary concern. "I'm working on an important project," he lied easily. Years of practice perfecting his ability to create false personas and stories for his parents. "The Tokyo Stock Exchange doesn't respect our sleep schedules." Sarah nodded, almost satisfied with the explanation. Overwork was the only acceptable excuse for any shortcoming in the Harrington family. "Well, try to get some rest." "Your father wants to discuss that investment proposal at dinner," she said, already turning to leave, her motherly duty discharged with minimal efficiency. Ryan closed the door and leaned against it, his heart racing as if he'd run a marathon. Every interaction with his parents was an exercise in dissembling, and he was tired of this game. A game with far higher stakes than any he played online. The clock on the wall read 4 in the afternoon, 8 hours until Castellano's deadline. His bank accounts were empty, his credit cards maxed out, his friends tired of unpaid loans. Ryan opened his desk drawer, removing a bottle of prescribed pills he'd stolen from his mother's medicine cabinet. He swallowed 2 Xanax dry, hoping they would calm his frantic heart and momentarily silence the growing panic in his mind. He needed a solution, any solution. It was then that his phone vibrated again, not Castellano this time, but a notification of a message on an obscure forum frequented by compulsive gamblers. An anonymous user was responding to his desperate plea for ideas. "I know a couple in the Upper East Side. No kids. Been trying to adopt for years. They'd pay big for a healthy baby, no questions asked. Interested in discussing further?" Ryan stared at the screen, a chill running down his spine. There was a line he swore he'd never cross, no matter how desperate he was. But then he remembered the beating from those men, the promise that next time would be much worse. He thought of the contempt in his father's eyes when he discovered his debts, the devastation on his mother's face as she saw the family name tarnished by scandal. With trembling fingers, Ryan typed a response. "Tell me more. How would this work? How much are we talking?" The reply came almost instantly, as if the contact had been anxiously waiting on the other side of the screen. Ryan looked at the message, his pupils dilating as he absorbed the words glowing in the darkened room. The offer was explicit and unambiguous. There was no way to interpret it innocently. The bluish glow of the screen illuminated his pale face, casting deep shadows that accentuated the transformation happening within him. In a moment of terrifying clarity, Ryan realized he had reached the bottom of the moral abyss. The fact that he was even considering the proposal meant he was no longer the person he'd always believed himself to be. Castellano wouldn't wait another day. The men who assaulted him would show no mercy on their next visit, and the family fortune, locked in accounts and investments he couldn't access, wouldn't save him. The abyss was calling, and for the first time, Ryan allowed himself to contemplate the unimaginable. "I know a wealthy family in the Upper East Side who would pay big money for a healthy baby. Do you have easy access to any?" The words seemed to pulse on the screen, as if they had a life of their own. Ryan closed his eyes, trying to block out the idea, but when he opened them, the message was still there, an invitation to hell masquerading as salvation. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, shaking not just with fear, but with a repulsive excitement at the prospect of a solution. With his head pounding and the Xanax beginning to numb his moral senses, he typed, "How much exactly are we talking? And what kind of access do you think I'd have?" The response came instantly, $250,000. Cash, no trail. As for access, I don't know. Does your family not have any staff with young kids? Undocumented workers are perfect. Less questions, less police investigation, you know? Ryan felt bile rising in his throat, the acid burning as he struggled to swallow the physical and moral nausea. Images began forming in his mind. The silent maid who cleaned up his messes without ever complaining. The wide-eyed little boy who occasionally accompanied her on school holidays. Gabriel, that was his name. Ryan had seen them interacting in the garden once, watching from his window as the mother braided flowers into the son's dark hair while he laughed uncontrollably. At the time, he'd even felt a pang of envy at the simplicity of that joy he'd never known in his own privileged childhood. "Maybe," he finally responded, the single word carrying the weight of an atrocious crime not yet committed. "I need details. How to ensure there's no connection back to me." A part of him was screaming to stop, to shut off the phone and confess everything to his parents, accept the consequences of his mistakes, but that voice was growing fainter, drowned out by the panic of self-preservation. The final message from the anonymous contact sealed the pact. "Meet me tomorrow, 10 a.m. at the abandoned parking lot behind the old cinema. No phones, come alone. We'll discuss details in person. Remember, $500,000. All your problems solved with a single move." Ryan looked out the window, watching Julia cross the lawn towards the bus stop, her small, tired figure after a full day of cleaning up the messes of the rich. She was invisible to most people in that exclusive neighborhood, just another worker among many, easily forgettable, easily disposable. In Ryan's disturbed mind, that made her the perfect target. With these dark thoughts dominating his psyche, he closed the curtains, blocking out the fading sunset and allowing the darkness to swallow him whole, not just the room, but his soul. The following day, the address provided by the anonymous contact led Ryan to an imposing brownstone in the upper part of the Upper East Side. The building, with its meticulously preserved sandstone facade, boasted tall windows with silk curtains and a wrought iron gate that must have cost more than the annual salary of most New Yorkers. Ryan adjusted his silk tie, hiding his trembling hands in the pockets of his Burberry coat. The decision to come here represented the definitive crossing of a moral line from which he knew there would be no return. Even so, with $75,000 in debt and dangerous men looking for him, hopelessness had already silenced any ethical objection that could still echo in his conscience. He was not selling a child, he told himself, as he rang the ornate doorbell. He was merely facilitating an adoption for a loving couple who could provide more than an immigrant maid could ever achieve. "Mr. Harrington, I presume?" The deep voice belonged to a tall, distinguished man in his 50s, impeccably dressed in a cashmere sweater and wool trousers under an elegant robe. "I am Dr. Andrew Blackwell. Please come in." The residence inside was even more impressive. Italian marble floors, contemporary artworks on the walls, antiques that seemed straight out of Sotheby's auctions. In the living room, a refined-looking woman rose to greet him. "This is my wife, Eleanor. I'm sure we can discuss this delicate matter in a civilized manner as educated people." Eleanor Blackwell exuded the artificial grace of someone who attended the finest prep schools. Her face seemed a perfectly composed mask, beautiful yet devoid of genuine emotion. "Would you care for a scotch?" Macallan, 25 years. "Help soothe the nerves in conversations like this," Andrew offered, already pouring the amber liquid into crystal glasses without waiting for a response. The ensuing conversation was surprisingly pragmatic, as if they were discussing the purchase of a property or an art investment, not the future of a 3-year-old child. "We've been trying to adopt through official channels for 5 years, Eleanor explained, her controlled voice barely concealing the underlying bitterness. "The waiting lists are endless, and the scrutiny is suffocating. There were psychological interviews, background checks, home visits, as if we had to prove we deserved to have a child." Andrew chimed in, his hand resting possessively on his wife's shoulder. "We offer a home that most children could only dream of. Private schools, music lessons, international travel, a substantial inheritance. All we ask is discretion and finality. No contact with the biological family, no future complications." Ryan downed the scotch in a single gulp, the liquor burning his throat as the financial proposal was laid out. $250,000. An amount that would not only solve his immediate debts, but also give him a breather to rebuild his life. When he spoke, he surprised himself with the steadiness of his own voice. "I have a child in mind, 3 years old, healthy, intelligent, son of a maid who works for my family. The boy stays with an elderly woman while she works. It will be relatively straightforward." Eleanor's eyes glinted with a disturbing intensity, causing Ryan to avert his gaze. It was as if she were already picturing the child in her expensive clothing, calling her mother, completing the perfect scenario she wished to project to the world. Andrew nodded briefly, moving on to logistics. "Half the amount up front, half upon delivery. No trails, no ties to us. We have adoption papers ready, authentic forms, just needing specific details. We have a judge who understands situations like ours." Back in the anonymous safety of a noisy Manhattan cafe, Ryan opened his laptop and began researching the elderly nanny's routine. Margaret Thompson, 72 years old, widowed, childless, retired for 10 years, a member of the Episcopal Church on 2nd Avenue, and most importantly, she took the boy to the same park every morning between 9 and 10 o'clock. Ryan studied photos of the location on Google Maps. Benches strategically placed, a small playground, enough trees to create blind spots, and only 2 main entrances. A cold smile formed on his lips as he typed messages to 2 underworld contacts, a woman who had worked as a stage actress and a man with a history of petty scams. He wouldn't do the dirty work himself. That would be too reckless. He scheduled a meeting for the next day when he would explain the plan. The woman would approach the elderly woman as a friendly grandmother, while the man created a convincing distraction. Everything had to appear an opportunistic crime, nothing that could be traced back to him or the Blackwells. The cafe in the Lower East Side was purposefully chosen for its diverse clientele and noisy atmosphere, where conversations blended into the general din. Ryan waited in a discreet corner, nervously checking his watch every few minutes. The first to arrive was Vanessa Monroe, a woman in her 50s with slightly graying brown hair and a demeanor that suggested someone accustomed to playing various roles in life. Her background included off-Broadway theater performances, a few local commercials, and more recently, minor insurance frauds and scams targeting lonely elderly individuals. What made her perfect for the job was not just her maternal appearance, but her proven ability to quickly gain strangers' trust. Ryan watched as she approached with studied confidence, wearing modest but tasteful clothing, exactly the type of person an elderly woman like Margaret Thompson would consider a potential friend. "Vanessa, thank you for coming," Ryan murmured, indicating the chair in front of him. She sat gracefully, her experienced eyes analyzing him as if assessing a character in a script. "Your friend Frank said it's a well-paid and relatively simple job. I'm all ears, as long as it doesn't involve direct violence." Her voice had a melodious quality, with that precise intonation of someone trained to manipulate emotions through the tone and rhythm of words. Ryan swallowed hard, carefully choosing his next words. "We only need you to befriend an elderly lady, gain her trust, briefly distract her. Nothing more. 5,000 up front, plus 5 after the job is done." Vanessa showed no reaction, but her eyes narrowed slightly. "That sounds suspicious, but I won't ask questions I don't want to hear the answers to. Show me the old lady, tell me about her, and leave the rest to me." 20 minutes later, the cafe door opened again to admit a burly man with rough features and an almost imperceptible scar above his right eyebrow. Kevin Donovan was 40 years old, had a history of minor offenses and a particular specialty, creating convincing distractions. A former paramedic discharged for misconduct, he knew enough about medical emergencies to simulate credible situations without causing actual harm. He approached the table, greeting Ryan with a curt nod and studying Vanessa with professional interest. "So, we're a team?" he asked directly, dispensing with formalities. Ryan nodded, discreetly sliding an envelope under the table. "Half now, half later. The plan is simple. You simulate a medical emergency at the park, something that requires immediate attention. An unconscious woman would be convincing." Kevin quickly flipped through the contents of the envelope, counting the bills with the efficiency of someone accustomed to questionable transactions. "Just one question. We're talking about a kidnapping, right?" His voice was low but direct, without the slightest hint of moral judgment. Ryan felt his stomach tighten, hearing the words spoken aloud for the first time. "A relocation," he automatically corrected, as if semantics could diminish the gravity of the crime. "The child goes to a wealthy family who can offer much more than the biological mother." Kevin laughed humorlessly, a harsh sound that expressed worldly knowledge. "It's always that justification. Look, I don't care about the details, as long as there's no violence against the child. I do my part, get my money, and we never knew each other." Vanessa observed the interaction with calculating eyes, silently evaluating the risks and benefits. "I need to know exactly how the elderly woman behaves, her routines, what would make her trust me quickly, and how long I have to establish contact before the event." Ryan opened his laptop, showing discreetly taken photos from the park over the past 2 days. "She always sits on the same bench, between 9 and 10 in the morning. She brings a book, but rarely reads. She prefers to interact with the child. She's religious, frequently mentions her church. Widowed, lonely, craving adult company. You'll have 2 days to establish initial contact, and on the 3rd day, we execute the plan." The three conspirators leaned over the table as Ryan detailed each move with almost obsessive precision. Times, positions, escape routes, and the rendezvous point where the child would be transferred to a third intermediary who would take him directly to the Blackwells. On the eve of the kidnapping, Ryan Harrington stayed awake late, watching the digital clock on his bedside table mark each passing minute with relentless precision. The window of his room framed a partial view of Central Park West, where tomorrow, the meticulously planned operation would be executed. His fingers drummed nervously on his phone, reviewing for the 10th time the encrypted messages exchanged with Vanessa and Kevin over the past 48 hours. Everything was prepared. Vanessa had reported 2 successful casual encounters with Margaret Thompson in the park, establishing an initial connection through conversations about imaginary grandchildren and homemade cookie recipes. The elderly woman, as predicted, had proven receptive to the company, starving for social interaction on her lonely mornings with little Gabriel. Kevin, in turn, had mapped every inch of the perimeter, identifying security cameras, potential regular witnesses, and confirming the escape route he would use after creating his elaborate medical distraction. Ryan opened the desk drawer and took out the document the Blackwells had given him, a falsified birth certificate, awaiting only the inclusion of the child's name and basic data. The paper seemed to burn in his hands, the physical materialization of the moral line he was about to definitively cross. It wasn't just a debt he would pay tomorrow, but a much higher price, his humanity. For a brief moment, he envisioned the smiling face of the boy he occasionally saw through the mansion's hallways when Julia brought him on school holidays for lack of choice. He quickly dismissed the image, mentally replacing it with the amount promised by the Blackwells: $250,000, freedom from Castellano's clutches, a chance to start over. "I have no choice," he whispered to the empty room, seeking absolution in the silent shadows. The plan would be executed at 9:30 the following morning, the precise moment when Margaret Thompson habitually sat on the east bench of the park, allowing Gabriel to play in the adjacent little playground. Ever vigilant, but vulnerable to the emotional manipulation Vanessa would execute with almost surgical precision. Wednesday morning dawned, with an almost perfect blue sky over Central Park, the kind of fall day that seemed drawn for New York postcards. Margaret Thompson walked slowly along the park's east trail, her 72-year-old body moving with the caution of someone well acquainted with the limits imposed by age, but her eyes remained alert, following Gabriel's energetic movements as he skipped a few steps ahead. The boy wore his favorite blue coat with dinosaur patches on the elbows, an early birthday gift Margaret had given him the previous week. His dark curls bounced with every hop, and his crystalline laughter seemed to attract smiles from every passerby who crossed his path. For Margaret, those mornings in the park were the highlight of her lonely days since losing her husband 5 years ago. Caring for Gabriel had brought back to her life not only purpose, but also that feeling of being needed, of making a difference in the world through the unconditional love she devoted to the little one. "Grandma Maggie, look," "A squirrel," Gabriel exclaimed, pointing to one of the many squirrels scurrying through the branches of the century-old trees. Margaret smiled at the informal title the boy had spontaneously bestowed on her months ago. She wasn't his biological grandmother, but in her heart she felt exactly that. "It's a very smart squirrel, looking for nuts for the winter," she replied, holding the little boy's hand firmly as they approached the playground. As usual, she chose the wooden bench with a prime view of the swings and slides, the one that allowed her to watch Gabriel playing without visual obstructions. From her crochet bag, she took out the book she always brought, more out of habit than real intention to read, and the carefully wrapped package of homemade chocolate chip cookies, the boy's favorite snack that she religiously prepared every night. "Margaret, what a pleasant coincidence to meet you again." The melodious voice belonged to the middle-aged woman she had met on the previous 2 days, Vanessa, if she remembered correctly. Brown hair with streaks of grey framed a kind face, with expression lines that suggested a life of smiles. She wore a cream cardigan set over grey wool pants, with a string of pearls that looked antique and valuable, the perfect image of an upper-middle-class suburban grandmother. "Vanessa, what a pleasure to see you again," Margaret responded, genuinely happy with the unexpected company. The conversations with the woman on previous days had been surprisingly pleasant, revealing common interests in gardening, traditional recipes, and more importantly, stories about children. Vanessa spoke with such fondness about her supposed grandchildren in Connecticut that Margaret felt an immediate connection, that unspoken complicity between women who have dedicated their lives to caring for others. "This must be the famous Gabriel. You were right, he's even more adorable than you described," commented Vanessa, observing the boy who was now playing on the slide, patiently waiting his turn in the small line of children. Margaret nodded with undisguised pride, her eyes never fully leaving the boy's figure while she talked. "He's the light of my life. So intelligent for his age, you know. Just yesterday he asked me why the sky is blue, and I tried to explain about light scattering, of course in a way he could understand." Vanessa smiled, that warm smile that had quickly won the elderly woman's trust. "I have some homemade ginger cookies here. Do you think he would like them? My grandchildren love them." Margaret hesitated for only a second. After all, they had already talked at length for 2 days, and Vanessa seemed to be such a respectable lady, so similar to herself. "I'm sure he will. Gabriel loves to try new treats." The conversation flowed naturally for 20 minutes, while Gabriel alternated between the swing and the slide, always under Margaret's watchful gaze. Occasionally the boy would run up to them to show some treasure he had found, a particularly colorful leaf, a shiny rock, before animatedly returning to his play. It was then that a scream cut through the peaceful air of the park. "Help! Can someone help? A woman has fainted." The male voice came from the direction of the public restrooms, about 30 meters from where they were sitting. Margaret instantly turned towards the sound. Several people were already moving in that direction, forming a small circle around what seemed to be an emergency. "My God," Margaret murmured, her gaze divided between the distant commotion and Gabriel, who was now repeatedly going down the slide, oblivious to the situation. "It seems serious. Maybe I should." Vanessa gently touched her arm with a look of genuine concern. "Go check it out, Margaret. You have experience in these situations. You might make a difference. I'll keep an eye on Gabriel for you. Don't worry." The elderly woman hesitated, decades of responsibility and care making her reluctant to leave the boy, even for a few minutes. "I don't know." Vanessa reassuringly squeezed her hand. "It's just a few minutes. I can see him perfectly from here, and you'll be just a few steps away. Someone might urgently need help." The urgency in the man's voice as he continued to call for help finally convinced Margaret. "I'll only be a few minutes. Gabriel is on the slide. He usually stays there for a good while." With one last look at the boy, Margaret got up and quickly walked towards the commotion, her elderly body moving as fast as it could, driven by the desire to help someone in need. She didn't notice Vanessa discreetly checking her watch, nor the man in a dark jacket approaching the playground area from the opposite direction. When Margaret reached the group of people, she saw a woman apparently unconscious on the ground, with Kevin kneeling by her side, checking her pulse and breathing with the competence of a medical professional. "Does anyone here have first aid training?" he asked, looking directly at Margaret, as if he knew her kindness wouldn't betray her and she wouldn't deny help. The elderly woman stepped forward, focused on the emergency, momentarily distracted from her primary responsibility. At that very moment, Vanessa calmly approached Gabriel, who had just come down the slide. "Hello, dear. Your grandmother had to help a lady who felt unwell. She asked me to take you to her. The boy looked hesitant, but the gentle, familiar smile of the woman, the same one who had offered delicious cookies just minutes before, lessened his natural mistrust. Vanessa extended her hand, which Gabriel accepted after a brief hesitation. With deliberately slow but steady steps, she guided the boy not towards the restrooms, but towards the east exit of the park, where a black car was waiting with the engine running. The supposed medical emergency dissipated as quickly as it had arisen. The fainted woman suddenly regained consciousness, claiming to have just had a low blood pressure episode, refusing any further assistance and hurrying away with mumbled thanks. Margaret, confused by the situation but relieved it was nothing serious, turned to return to the playground. It was at that instant that an inexplicable chill ran down her spine, an ancestral premonition that only women who have dedicated their lives to caring for children recognize. Something was wrong. Her steps involuntarily quickened, her heart beating at an erratic rhythm that had nothing to do with physical exertion. Her eyes frantically searched for the blue coat with dinosaur patches, the small figure that should have been going down the slide, the little hands that should have been waving at her. The space she had previously occupied with Vanessa was empty, with no sign of the woman or, more importantly, no sign of Gabriel. Gabriel? The first call came out as a question, as if there were any doubt, any simple explanation for the boy's absence. Gabriel! The second call echoed louder, attracting curious looks from other nannies and mothers. Margaret spun in a circle, examining every corner of the playground, advancing to check under the toys, behind the nearby trees. Gabriel! The third scream was no longer a call, but a visceral lament that seemed to tear the very fabric of the peaceful reality of the park. Her legs faltered, and she had to lean on a bench to avoid falling, as the horrible realization of what had happened began to take shape in her mind. A group of strangers approached, drawn by her cries of despair. "My boy! He's gone! Has anyone seen a 3-year-old boy? Dark curly hair, blue coat with dinosaurs." The words came out broken, her breathing irregular, her wide eyes scanning the faces around for any sign of recognition. A young mother with a baby in her arms gently touched her shoulder. "You were with a woman in a beige coat, weren't you? I saw you two leaving through the east entrance." Margaret clutched the woman's arm with surprising strength for her age. "Which direction? How long ago?" The young woman stepped back slightly, startled by the intensity of the reaction. "Maybe 10 minutes? I thought you were grandmother and grandson." Another park-goer, a middle-aged runner, already had his phone in hand. "I'm calling the police. What's the boy's name? What's he wearing?" The practical questions pierced the fog of panic enveloping Margaret, giving her a momentary focus. Gabriel Martinez, 3 years old, blue coat with dinosaur patches on the elbows, jeans, red sneakers. Please find him. I only left him for a minute. Just 1 minute." The arrival of the police vehicles, with their strobe lights cutting through the park's serenity, seemed to occur simultaneously in slow motion, and accelerated. 2 uniformed officers approached, while others began isolating the area and questioning potential witnesses. "Mrs. Thompson, I'm Officer Rivera. This is Officer Chen. We need you to tell us exactly what happened, without omitting any details." Margaret felt like she was having a vivid nightmare, as if at any moment she could wake up and find Gabriel safe, waiting for her chocolate chip cookies. Her trembling hands clung to the crochet bag, from which she withdrew a recent photograph of the boy she always carried with her. This is the boy, a woman named Vanessa. She showed up the day before yesterday. We talked. She seemed so kind, so normal. Said she had grandchildren in Connecticut. Margaret's voice failed, breaking into uncontrollable sobs. Officer Chen jotted down every word, his face maintaining the professional neutrality that concealed the gravity with which he regarded the situation. "Would you be able to describe this woman? Height, weight, distinctive features?" Margaret closed her eyes, trying to visualize Vanessa, now realizing how the details that once seemed so clear became hazy under the pressure of fear. 50s, brown hair with gray streaks, a pearl necklace, subtle makeup, local accent. The descriptions seemed tragically generic even to her own ears. Officer Rivera was already speaking into his radio, transmitting the limited description and requesting verification from security cameras at the park exits. Margaret heard scattered phrases about Amber Alert, search teams and security perimeter, but they all seemed distant, as if reaching her through a glass wall that increasingly separated her from reality. In the imposing Harrington residence, Julia meticulously scrubbed the kitchen's marble floor, her mechanical and precise movements reflecting years of practice in the trade that secured her livelihood. Beads of sweat trickled down her forehead as she applied extra force to a persistent stain, her mind wandering to the end of the day when she could finally embrace Gabriel and hear his animated stories about the adventures in the park with Mrs. Margaret. This simple thought was what kept her functioning day after day, motion after motion, in a job that demanded her body but rarely engaged her mind. The mansion was silent that morning. Mrs. Harrington had gone out for her monthly charity luncheon. Mr. Harrington was at his downtown office, and Ryan, as far as she knew, was still asleep in his upstairs bedroom, oblivious to the world around him as he often was. The only sound breaking the silence was the soft hum of the vacuum cleaner that the other cleaning staff, Carmen, was running in the adjacent living room. Julia's cell phone suddenly vibrated in her bag, the sound amplified by the room's stillness. She stood up, puzzled by the out-of-hour call. No one ever called her during working hours except in case of emergency. Her heart instantly raced when she saw Margaret's number on the screen, something that had never happened before. She answered with trembling fingers, pressing the handset to her ear as she tried to control the fear already growing in her chest. "Hello? Mrs. Margaret?" The voice on the other end was not the elderly woman's but a man's, formal and measured. "Mrs. Martinez, this is Detective Rivera from the New York Police Department. I'm with Mrs. Thompson right now. There's been an incident at the park." The world around Julia began to blur, the following words hitting her like physical blows. "Your son went missing, possible abduction, ongoing investigation." The cell phone slipped from her fingers, hitting the floor with a dull thud that echoed through the immaculate kitchen. Her legs gave way without warning, and she collapsed onto her knees on the floor she had just cleaned, a primal scream erupting from her core, ripping through her throat and exploding into the air in a wave of pure despair. Her hands clutched her own face, her nails leaving red streaks on her cheeks as her entire body convulsed in violent sobs. Carmen rushed into the kitchen, alarmed by the inhuman sound, finding Julia hunched over herself, rocking back and forth, repeating over and over through tears, "Not my son, please. Not my Gabriel. Please God, not my son." The taxi had barely stopped when Julia leapt out, not waiting for change, running toward the yellow police tape now surrounding the playground area. Her face was unrecognizable, disfigured by anguish, eyes swollen from crying relentlessly during the journey that had seemed endless. Her legs wobbled, threatening to buckle under the weight of an unbearable reality, but something more powerful than physical strength propelled her through the park, that primal motherly instinct that transcends bodily limits when a child is in danger. Uniformed officers, some with sniffer dogs, scoured every inch of the site, while plainclothes detectives questioned potential witnesses. The word abduction hung in the air like an invisible poison, contaminating what was once a space of childlike joy. Julia spotted Margaret sitting in a patrol car, a diminutive and frail figure, her shoulders hunched under an invisible weight, a silver thermal blanket draped over her back, despite the day not being particularly cold. "Where is my son? Please, someone tell me what happened to my son." Julia's voice, hoarse from previous screams, tore through the air, drawing compassionate glances from the officers. A detective approached, his face a mask of professional neutrality that barely concealed the underlying compassion. "Mrs. Martinez, I'm Detective Morales. I need you to remain calm so we can work efficiently." Julia clutched the sleeve of his coat, her fingers digging into the fabric like claws. "My Gabriel is out there somewhere with strangers. Don't ask me to be calm. What do you know? What are you doing to find him?" The detective gently guided her away from the police tapes, his voice low and controlled. "We have a description of the suspect. We issued an Amber Alert immediately. All city exits are being monitored. I need you to provide us with any information that might help. People who might have motives. Anything unusual you've noticed recently." Margaret rose unsteadily as she saw Julia, her face as devastated as the mother's, aged 10 years in just a few hours. Silent tears streamed down her wrinkled cheeks as she shuffled hesitantly toward Julia. "Forgive me. Oh God, Julia, forgive me," the old woman pleaded, her voice almost inaudible. "I should never have let him. It was just for a minute. That woman seemed so trustworthy." Julia looked at the former governess, a storm of conflicting emotions, anger, compassion, despair crossing her face. She could blame her, shout, unload her pain, but the devastated look in the old woman's eyes revealed a suffering as deep as her own. In an unexpected impulse, Julia embraced Margaret, and together they shared a moment of pure, absolute grief, two women united by the devastating absence of the same beloved child. 3 days after Gabriel's disappearance, Julia returned to the Harrington mansion. no longer as an employee but as a desperate supplicant. Her body functioned on the automatism of shock, moving like a ghost through the corridors she had cleaned for years. Her eyes, sunken in deep hollows like open wounds, reflected sleepless nights spent in police stations, hospitals, and on the streets, searching for any sign of her son. When Sarah Harrington received her in the living room, the contrast between the two women could not be more glaring. The mistress, immaculately dressed in her cashmere ensemble, sitting rigidly on the Italian leather sofa. Julia, disheveled, wearing the same clothes as days before, clinging to a small stuffed bear of Gabriel's, as if it were a life preserver in an ocean of despair. William Harrington remained standing by the fireplace, his face a mask of distant formality, discreetly checking his watch as Julia explained the reason for her visit. "We need help to expand the search," Julia pleaded, her voice breaking on every syllable. The detective said additional resources could make a difference. Specialized sniffer dogs, security consultants, even private detectives. "If you could just..." Sarah Harrington raised her hand, interrupting the flow of words with a studiedly elegant gesture. "Julia, we deeply regret your situation. It is truly tragic. But you must understand that there are limits to our involvement in personal matters of employees." William cleared his throat, assuming the condescending tone he reserved for troublesome staff. "We have granted your unpaid leave, which is already quite generous considering the circumstances. As for funding private investigations, well, that would create a complicated precedent. I'm sure the police are doing everything in their power." The couple exchanged quick glances, that silent communication of people who share the same discomfort with a situation they deem unsuitable for their orderly world. In the following weeks, Gabriel's case gradually transformed from headline to footnote, then to statistic, and finally to a dusty file. The detectives assigned to the case, initially motivated and tireless, began to space out their update calls. The leads that seemed promising, a suspicious black car, a woman with a similar description spotted in Queens, an anonymous call about a crying child, all led to dead ends. Julia watched powerless as the initial urgency of the investigation gave way to bureaucratic resignation. "Mrs. Martinez," Detective Morales explained during his last visit to the minuscule apartment that now seemed absurdly empty without Gabriel's laughter. "Without new physical evidence, reliable eyewitnesses, or some kind of ransom demand, our investigative options are severely limited." His words sounded like death sentences for the hope Julia was still trying to keep alive. "The case remains open, of course," he added, unable to meet her eyes. "But I must be honest that, without new developments, resources will be redirected to more recent cases. 5 winters, 5 springs, 5 birthdays without blown candles." The calendar on the wall of Julia's new apartment, smaller, cheaper, closer to the treatment center where Margaret now resided after a partial stroke, marked another December. She had decorated the small artificial tree in the corner of the room with the same colorful lights Gabriel had loved, keeping the tradition alive as if, at any moment, the door could open and her son could come running in, now 8 years old, asking for hot chocolate with marshmallows. The apartment was filled with ghosts of unlived possibilities. The room she kept intact, with the bed now too big for a 3-year-old boy, the clothes still folded in the dresser, which would never fit the child growing somewhere far from her arms, the toys carefully preserved that would never again hear laughter. Julia moved among these remnants like a priestess of a particular cult, keeping the flame of memory burning, refusing to let the world forget that Gabriel Martinez had existed, had been born, had breathed, had loved, and had disappeared. The first years of despair still danced in her mind. They were of frantic searching, all her free time, all her savings, every drop of energy dedicated to finding her son. She distributed flyers, appeared on television shows about missing persons, hired private detectives with borrowed money, entered online communities of parents in similar situations. Her face briefly became known, the maid whose son was kidnapped from the park, before the relentless cycle of the media moved on to other, more recent tragedies. The third year brought a bitter reality. Julia had to return to full-time work, no longer for the Harringtons, who had formally dismissed her after 6 months of unpaid leave, but in 3 different jobs that barely paid the rent and bills. The searches continued, but now crammed into the few hours between shifts, with dwindling resources, facing doors that closed with increasing impatience. In the 4th year, Detective Morales retired, and the new case officer barely knew the details, referring to Gabriel as the boy from case 25C. "You need to consider the possibility of moving on, dear," suggested her new supervisor at the cleaning company, a kind woman who saw Julia's silent suffering every day. "I'm not saying to forget, just to allow yourself to live again." Julia merely smiled, that empty smile she had learned to offer when well-meaning people tried to help her get over something that could never be gotten over. How to explain that each morning began with the same excruciating thought? Was he alive? Was he safe? Would he remember her? How to describe that phantom sensation, like an amputated limb, the constant awareness of the absence of a vital part of herself? Somewhere in another home, another life, her son was breathing, growing, learning words she had not taught, developing tastes she did not know, gradually becoming a stranger. This alternate reality tortured her dreams, turning them into nightmares from which she awoke gasping, calling a name no one answered. On the wall above the desk, a photo mural showed the digital progressions created by experts, how Gabriel might appear at 4, 5, 6, 7, and now 8 years old. The smiling child gradually transformed into a boy with more defined features, slowly losing his baby traits, gaining the facial structure that would define the man he would one day become. Julia looked at those images every night before sleeping, a painful ritual she refused to abandon. "I won't give up on you," she whispered to the most recent portrait, touching the printed face with trembling fingers. "Even if it takes my whole life, I will keep searching." But on the loneliest nights, when exhaustion overcame her determination, an insidious voice whispered in her mind, "What if he doesn't even remember you anymore?" The Coleman family's living room gleamed under the afternoon Sunday light, streaming through the wide French windows. Julia methodically waved the duster over the silver-framed portraits lining the console, each frame displaying perfect moments from the new employers' lives: vacations in Aspen, graduations from elite universities, elegant weddings in immaculate gardens. She had been working for the Colemans for only 3 months, one of 4 houses she cleaned weekly, to earn a minimally sufficient income to survive. This private job had been secured through the domestic cleaning agency she now worked for, a smaller company, with fewer benefits than her previous job, but one that didn't care about her record of absences in the early years after Gabriel's disappearance. Julia had developed a peculiar ability to be physically present, while her mind wandered in its own limbo, executing household tasks with automatic perfection, while her thoughts remained fixed on her missing son, now an 8-year-old boy who existed only in digital projections and her stubborn dreams. The Colemans, Robert, a cardiovascular surgeon, and Emily, a marketing director for a pharmaceutical company, were comfortably settled on the Italian modular sofa, absorbed in the live broadcast of a decisive Yankees game on the enormous flat-screen TV that dominated an entire wall. The couple's occasional celebrations were mere background noise for Julia, who had learned to work in an emotional isolation bubble that shielded her from the painful contrast between others' happiness and her own emptiness. "Great play! They're crushing it today," exclaimed Robert Coleman, raising a craft beer in a solitary toast to the television. Julia merely nodded politely as she moved to the bookshelves, organizing volumes that were already perfectly aligned, removing non-existent dust from expensive spines that, she suspected, had never been opened. The game announcer cheerfully announced that the cameras were showing fans in the stadium, that traditional moment when anonymous faces gain their 15 seconds of fame in the national broadcast. "Look how cute those little Yankees cap-wearing boys are," commented Emily, pointing to the screen where a group of children appeared, waving flags and smiling enthusiastically at the camera. Julia cast an automatic glance toward the television, a gesture of courtesy to her employer, and then the world stopped spinning. Among the smiling children, the camera specifically focused on a boy of about 8 years old, with curly brown hair, a slightly upturned nose, and most distinctively, a small crescent-shaped birthmark on his right temple, partially visible under the brim of his cap. Time froze in that eternal instant when Julia's heart forgot to beat. It wasn't a possibility, it wasn't a resemblance, it wasn't desperate longing turning a stranger into her lost son. It was Gabriel. Her knees buckled abruptly, and the duster slipped from her suddenly numb fingers, hitting the hardwood floor with a dull thud that the Colemans didn't even register. "Mrs. Coleman," Julia whispered, her voice so fragile that it barely came out. Who is that boy? The one with the birthmark?" Emily looked at her with mild irritation at the interruption, but something in Julia's devastated expression made her respond, "Oh, that must be the Blackwell's son. They have seats in the VIP section, near ours. We don't know them personally, but Robert did operate on Mr. Blackwell's mother last year." The camera had moved to another section of the stadium, but Julia remained paralyzed, fixing the television as if she could bring the image back through sheer force of will. "Michael, I think his name is," Emily continued absent-mindedly, turning her attention back to the game. "They're quite private, that family. They say they adopted the boy, but they rarely talk about it. Very discreet people, you know how the high society is." Julia wasn't listening anymore. A deafening buzz filled her ears as her mind processed the information in slow motion. Blackwell, VIP seats, an adopted son, the birthmark she had kissed every night for 3 years. Julia's legs began to tremble violently, and she had to lean against the nearest bookshelf for support. I need a glass of water," she muttered, more to herself than to her employers, who were now observing her with puzzled expressions. Julia stumbled toward the kitchen, her brain working feverishly. She needed proof. She needed an image. She needed absolute certainty before rekindling the flame of hope that threatened to consume her completely. With trembling fingers, she took her cell phone out of her back pocket and, discreetly returning to the living room, pretended to continue cleaning while positioning herself to capture an image of the screen the next time the cameras showed the fans. "Please," she prayed silently, "just one more time, show him just one more time." As if pulled by an invisible force, Julia abandoned her position in the corner of the room and approached the television like a somnambulist, each step uncertain and trembling. Her skin, normally a healthy olive tone, had acquired a sepulchral pallor that highlighted the permanent dark circles that 5 years of fruitless searching had sculpted on her face. Her calloused hands, hardened by years of manual labor and harsh chemicals, involuntarily extended toward the screen, as if they could pass through the glass and reach the child on the other side. Her body visibly trembled as her pupils dilated, fixing on the image that had already disappeared, replaced by a pitcher adjusting his glove on the mound. But for Julia, the boy in the cap was still there, etched onto her retina, imprinted on her soul with the force of a lightning bolt illuminating the darkest night. Every detail of that face, the specific curve of the eyebrows, the slight deviation in the nasal septum she had noticed since birth, and mainly the crescent-shaped birthmark she had so often kissed before sleeping, confirmed what her maternal heart already knew without a shred of doubt: she had found her missing son. "Julia, are you okay?" Emily Coleman's voice reached her distantly, as if from another world, unable to fully penetrate the shock bubble enveloping Julia. The couple stared at their employee with expressions mixing confusion and mild irritation at the interruption of the game. Robert had already paused the broadcast, freezing the frame on a close-up of the pitcher, unconsciously frustrating Julia's desperate desire to see the boy in the stands again. The air seemed to have grown thick, resistant to Julia's lungs as she struggled to inhale, while black spots danced at the edges of her vision. A sense of impending faintness made her lean heavily against the nearest wall, her nails digging into the plaster, as if seeking anchorage in the reality that threatened to dissolve around her. "Do you need to sit down? You're looking like you might pass out," Emily continued, rising from the couch reluctantly, more concerned about the possibility of a medical emergency in her immaculate living room than her employee's actual well-being. "It's him," Julia finally managed to articulate, her voice reduced to a hoarse whisper that barely carried sound. "The boy, at the stadium, with the birthmark." Her words came out broken, interrupted by short, shallow breaths that didn't provide enough oxygen for her panicked brain. Robert frowned, exchanging confused looks with his wife before turning back to Julia. "Who are you talking about? Do you know someone at the game?" The casual question, made without comprehending the magnitude of the moment, was like a spark that ignited something in Julia, a fierce resolve that made her force the words out with all the clarity she could muster. "That boy, the one you called Michael Blackwell, it's Gabriel, my son, the son who was kidnapped 5 years ago in Central Park." The statement hung in the air like a bomb about to explode, transforming the atmosphere of the elegant living room. The silence that followed was dense and suffocating. Emily instinctively stepped back, as if Julia's words were contagious. Robert, on the other hand, automatically assumed the professional and distant expression he reserved for patients he considered emotionally unstable. "Julia, I think you should sit down and drink some water. You're clearly very upset for some reason." His paternalistic, almost condescending tone didn't register with Julia, who remained fixated on the urgent need to see the image on the screen again to confirm what she already knew in her core. "Please," she begged, pointing at the remote in Robert's hands, "rewind the recording. Show me the boy again. I have photos. I have projections of what he would look like today. I have the medical record with the birthmark." Her voice failed again when she saw Emily's expression harden, the initial sympathy transforming into something colder and more calculated. "I think you should take the rest of the day off, Julia," Emily stated firmly, her voice taking on a businesslike tone that didn't allow for argument. "You're clearly not in a condition to work today. We can talk about this another time when you're more composed." Robert nodded in agreement, adding, "Stress can do strange things to our minds, you know. As a doctor, I see it all the time. Our minds play tricks on us when we want something badly enough." The couple subtly moved to create a physical barrier between Julia and the television, like unwitting guardians of an image that could confirm or destroy the newfound hope kindling in the broken mother's heart. Julia understood what they were doing, comprehended what they thought, that she was just another disturbed employee, imagining things, making connections where there were none. But for the first time in 5 years, certainty pulsed through her veins with renewed strength. She had found Gabriel, and nothing, absolutely nothing, would stop her from reaching him this time. With hands still trembling but propelled by a determination she hadn't felt in years, Julia composed herself enough to nod as if agreeing with the Coleman's suggestion to take the rest of the day off. The couple visibly relaxed, interpreting her apparent acquiescence as acceptance of her emotional confusion. Robert unfroze the broadcast with a casual touch of the remote, returning their attention to the game, as if the little drama with the housekeeper had been merely an inconvenient interruption to their perfect Sunday. Emily murmured something about fetching water from the kitchen, clearly anxious to escape the uncomfortable emotional intensity that filled the room. The momentary lapse was exactly the opportunity Julia needed. The announcer cheerfully declared, "And now as the players get ready for the next inning, let's take another look at our fans out there." And like an answer to her silent prayers, the camera panned the stands again, highlighting smiling families and enthusiastic supporters, until there he was again, the little Michael Blackwell, now biting into a hot dog, his face partially covered with mustard, but unmistakable to the eyes of a mother who had never stopped searching for those features in every child she passed on the streets. With calculated movements that disguised the emotional earthquake within, Julia slid her hand into her uniform pocket and extracted her phone, positioning it discreetly to capture the image on the screen. The autofocus adjusted, and her finger pressed the capture button repeatedly, ensuring multiple photographs of the fleeting moment before the stadium camera moved on to other spectators. The evidence was secure now, pixelated, distant, imperfect, but enough to start what would be her last and most important battle for the recovery of her son. As she swiftly pocketed the phone just as Emily returned with a glass of water that would go undrunk, Julia was already calculating her next steps. The retired Detective Morales, who still kept in touch, the pro bono lawyer from the Association for Parents of Missing Children, the new detective in charge of the case, who barely knew the details but would be forced to listen now that she had concrete evidence. "Thank you for the day off," she said calmly, the storm within her invisible behind a mask of apparent resignation. "I think I do need to rest." But as she gathered her cleaning supplies and prepared to leave, a single thought consumed her mind. "I found you, Gabriel, and this time I won't lose you again." The New York Police Department, 14th Precinct, maintained the same institutional smell of cheap disinfectant and reheated coffee that Julia remembered from her countless visits in the months after Gabriel's disappearance. The receptionist barely looked up as she approached, just another anonymous face in an endless parade of citizens with problems. Julia waited nearly 2 hours in the waiting room, clutching her phone between her fingers until the knuckles whitened, mentally rehearsing what she would say, how she would present her evidence in a way that made it impossible to ignore. When she was finally called, she discovered that Detective Walsh, a man in his 50s, with deep under-eye circles and a permanently skeptical expression, had inherited her son's case after Morales' retirement. The interrogation room they led her to was impersonal and cold, with pale grey walls and a metal table that had witnessed more human tragedies than any therapist would ever hear. The rigid plastic chair seemed particularly uncomfortable as Julia slid her phone across the table's surface, the screen displaying the zoomed-in image she had captured from the Coleman's television broadcast. "Detective Walsh, I know it may seem unbelievable, but it's him. It's Gabriel," Julia declared, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "These specific markings, the shape of his eyes, the small scar on his chin that he got when he fell off a chair at age 2, and most importantly, this crescent-shaped birthmark on his right temple. There is no other child with this exact combination of features." Walsh examined the photo with the professional neutrality that veteran cops master, his face betraying absolutely nothing. After what seemed an eternity, he finally spoke. "Mrs. Martinez, I understand your conviction, but we have to follow protocols. We can't just raid a family's home based on a photo taken off a television. The Blackwells are extremely influential people in this city. He's a renowned doctor. She's from old money. We need a lot more than this before we can take any action. Julia felt the familiar desperation starting to rise in her throat, threatening to choke her with the sense of powerlessness she had known so many times over the past 5 years. But something had changed inside her. That brief glimpse of Gabriel had ignited a fierce determination that would no longer be ignored. They claim to have legally adopted him, she continued, leaning forward intently. Check the records. If it's a legitimate adoption, there must be full documentation. I never gave my son up for adoption. He was kidnapped. Someone falsified documents. The detective sighed, but there was something about the simple logic and absolute conviction in the woman's eyes across from him that made him nod slowly. I can request a verification of the adoption records. If there are irregularities in the documentation, we'll have grounds to proceed. The following 72 hours were a torture of waiting for Julia, who could barely eat or sleep, each minute stretching like an eternity as she imagined her son so close yet still inaccessible. When her phone finally rang in the early hours of the third day, Walsh's voice sounded different, the skepticism replaced by professional urgency. Mrs. Martinez, we found something. The Blackwells' adoption records contain significant inconsistencies, dates that don't match up, an adoption agency that mysteriously closed shortly after the process, and most importantly, the signature of an alleged birth mother, a Jane Smith, that records indicate does not exist. I got a warrant to investigate further. I'm not promising anything yet, but we have enough reason to take this case seriously now. In a reality far removed from Julia's nightmare, the Blackwells' lawyer's office exuded power and prestige, cherry wood paneling on the walls, authentic Persian rugs, and floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of Manhattan. Lawrence Hoffman, senior partner at Hoffman, Weissman & Partners, regarded detectives Walsh and Rodriguez with the cool superiority of someone accustomed to intimidating opponents with his mere presence. By his side, Andrew and Eleanor Blackwell projected the perfect image of anguished, wronged parents. He in his magazine cover-worthy, impeccable suit, she with carefully controlled tears that did not compromise her flawless makeup. The theatricality of the scene did not escape Detective Walsh, who had witnessed similar performances throughout his 27-year career. The elegant conference room had become a battlefield where the opening skirmishes of a painful war were beginning to unfold, with a child's future as the prize for the victor. My clients are exemplary citizens who acted in complete good faith, Hoffman declared, his voice polished but firm as he flipped through a meticulously prepared dossier. Dr. Blackwell saves lives daily at Presbyterian Hospital. His wife raises millions for underprivileged children through her foundation. They endured years of frustrated attempts at having biological children before turning to adoption. They followed all legal protocols, paid substantial fees to the Private Hearts Adoptions Agency, and received assurances that the birth mother had voluntarily relinquished her rights. Eleanor sobbed delicately, leaning into the silk handkerchief her husband offered. How could we have imagined something was amiss? Michael has been our son for 5 years. He knows no other family than ours. This housekeeper is causing irreparable trauma to our family with unfounded allegations based on a blurred photo. Detective Walsh kept his expression neutral, but his eyes did not miss the slight tremor in Andrew Blackwell's hands, a detail his years investigating suspects had trained him to notice. Records indicate the agency that facilitated the adoption closed mere weeks after the finalization, and its owners vanished. We find that, at the very least, suspicious. Andrew straightened in his chair, his voice taking on a defensive tone. As a physician, I relied on the agency's reputation. I'm no expert in adoption bureaucracy. We paid over $100,000 in fees and processes, all documented. If there were irregularities, we too are victims here, Hoffman interjected swiftly. My clients will not allow their child to be ripped from the only home he has ever known based on physical coincidences and conspiracy theories. This is persecution of an upstanding family. The meeting ended at an impasse, as Walsh had expected. 3 days later, in the private chambers of New York County Family Court Judge Theodore Abernathy, the stoic judge, whose decades of experience with wrenching child custody battles showed on his impassive expression, listened intently as both sides made their heated arguments. After 2 hours of impassioned back and forth between the prosecution and the Blackwells' defense, the judge removed his reading glasses and pronounced with the crystalline clarity that had made him renowned in legal circles. The evidence presented is sufficiently disturbing to warrant a thorough investigation. Given the seriousness of the allegations and the well-being of the child in question, this court orders the immediate administration of a DNA test to determine biological maternity. The sample will be collected in a non-invasive manner that respects the emotional well-being of the minor, under supervision of a court officer. Until the conclusion of this process, the current legal custodians shall retain temporary custody, but are prohibited from leaving the state of New York with the child. The New York State Forensics Lab maintained a clinical austerity that contrasted sharply with the emotional storm unfolding within its walls. Julia waited alone in the sterile waiting room, her fingers interlocked so tightly that her nails left crescent indents in her palms. The 2-week wait for the results had been an exercise in psychological torture, each minute stretching like a rubber band as images of Gabriel flooded her mind constantly. When the door finally opened, revealing Detective Walsh accompanied by the lab's forensic geneticist, Dr. Winters, and a prosecutorial representative, Julia felt her legs weaken. Something in the detective's expression, an almost imperceptible softening of his usual stony demeanor, sent an electric current of hope coursing through her body even before a word was spoken. Dr. Winters, a middle-aged woman whose face carried the solemnity of the science she practiced, held a sealed folder as if it contained a precious treasure, and indeed it did. Mrs. Martinez, began the scientist, her professional voice masking any underlying emotion, we analyzed the collected samples following the most stringent protocols of forensic genetics. The DNA markers were compared at 17 distinct locations, according to federal standards for kinship testing. Julia held her breath, the entire world shrinking to this single moment, this single room, these words that had the power to resuscitate or definitively bury her hope. The geneticist continued after a pause that seemed eternal. The results are conclusive, with a margin of error of less than 1 in a billion. The minor identified as Michael Blackwell is, without any scientific doubt, your biological son, Gabriel Martinez. The report slid across the table, numbers and technical terms dancing before Julia's blurred eyes. Maternal compatibility, matching alleles, exclusion of null hypothesis. Words that, in their arid scientific language, proved what her mother's heart had always known. Walsh cleared his throat, breaking the charged silence that followed the announcement. With these results, we are proceeding with a full criminal investigation into the kidnapping and possible complicity at all levels. The prosecutor is preparing the documents to present to the court today. Julia no longer heard. Silent tears streamed down her face as her fingers traced the curves of the graph that scientifically proved the bond she had never ceased to feel in every cell of her body. The truth, now incontestable, sealed in ink and letterhead, Gabriel was her son. The New York County Family Court imposed an intimidating solemnity that seemed designed to crush the already fragile spirits of those who passed through its imposing doors. Judge Abernathy's massive courtroom, with its dark wood-paneled walls and austere portraits of former judges, was divided like a battlefield. On one side, Julia Martinez, wearing the best outfit she had managed to buy at a last-minute clearance sale, a slightly oversized navy blazer, and a skirt she had ironed 3 times that morning. By her side was Caroline Dawson, the pro bono attorney from the Coalition for Missing Children, a 40-year-old woman with sharp eyes and the fierce determination of someone who had chosen to defend causes over fortune. On the other side of the central aisle, the Blackwells formed a picture of studied perfection. Eleanor in an impeccable Chanel suit that cost more than Julia's annual salary, Andrew in a handcrafted suit that exuded refined privilege. Flanking them was not only Lawrence Hoffman, but an entire team of legal assistants armed with organized stacks of documents and meticulously rehearsed arguments. We are here to determine the custody of the minor formerly known as Michael Blackwell, now identified by forensic DNA testing as Gabriel Martinez, announced Judge Abernathy, his voice echoing through the room as he leafed through documents on his raised bench. The magistrate, known for his rigorous impartiality, looked over his reading glasses at the 2 sides of the dispute. I want to make it clear that this is not a criminal hearing, that investigation proceeds separately. Our sole focus here is to determine what best serves the interests of the child in question. Julia felt a chill run down her spine at these words. The interests of the child, as if there could be any possible debate about where a son should be, other than with his true mother. Her fingers tightened around the small photograph of 3-year-old Gabriel that she kept in her pocket like a talisman, the last record of her son before his disappearance. On the other side, Eleanor Blackwell was pressing a silk handkerchief to her eyes, a carefully calibrated display of maternal anguish. Lawrence Hoffman rose first, his posture emanating the confidence of someone who rarely lost a legal battle. Your Honor, we acknowledge the tragedy of this situation for all parties involved. However, we must consider the devastating psychological impact of wrenching a child from the only home he has ever consciously known. His modulated voice resonated with practiced authority as he gestured toward the Blackwells. For 5 crucial years of childhood development, my clients have provided stability, excellent education, exemplary medical care, and above all, unconditional love. Gabriel, or Michael as they know him, recognizes only Eleanor and Andrew as his parents. He has no memory of his former life. The lawyer paused strategically, letting the words sink in. We will present testimony from 3 renowned child psychologists who unanimously agree transferring custody now would be profoundly traumatic for the boy's emotional development, potentially causing irreparable harm. Caroline Dawson rose immediately after, her petite frame radiating an intensity that filled the room. Your Honor, let's talk about trauma. Let's talk about a mother who had her 3-year-old son ripped away from her through a violent crime. Let's talk about 5 years of relentless searching. When authorities and systems failed her repeatedly, her voice trembled slightly with controlled emotion, but her eyes remained steady. Julia Martinez never abandoned her son. He was stolen from her. And now, when she has finally found him, when science has proven beyond any doubt that she is the biological mother, it is suggested she should remain separated from him for the good of the child. What message are we sending about crime and justice? When the judge called for Julia to take the stand, she walked to the podium with shaking legs and a heart pounding against her ribs. The courtroom's fluorescent light seemed excessively bright, exposing every emotion on her face as she briefly glanced toward where the Blackwells were seated, the family who had raised her son for the past 5 years. She had spent the previous night rehearsing her words with Caroline, but now, in front of the microphone, all preparations seemed inadequate to express the depth of her loss and longing. How could she put into words the hollowness that occupied her chest every morning upon waking, the way she still instinctively bought Gabriel's favorite cereals at the grocery store, how she kept his little toothbrush by the bathroom sink as a silent memorial? The tears came without warning, but she quickly wiped them away, determined to remain strong so that her pain would not be interpreted as weakness or instability. I never abandoned my son, Julia began, her voice initially fragile but gaining strength as the words flowed. That morning I dressed him, fed him, kissed his forehead, before leaving him with Mrs. Margaret while I went to work to support him. At no point did I choose not to be his mother. That choice was stolen from me by people who decided my love wasn't enough because it didn't come with bulging bank accounts. She took a deep breath, her eyes now dry and resolute as she met the judge's gaze. For 5 years I never stopped looking for him. I handed out flyers until my hands ached, saved every penny to hire private detectives, begged television shows to display his face. I kept his room exactly as it was, so that when he came back, he would know he was never forgotten or replaced. That is not abandonment, Your Honor. That is love that refuses to be extinguished even when the whole world tells you to move on. The testimony of Eleanor Blackwell took place right after, her polished elegance contrasting sharply with Julia's raw emotion. The socialite sat ramrod straight, her back never touching the chair's backrest, her perfectly manicured hands folded in her lap as she spoke in the practiced smoothness of one who attends charity events. Michael came to us as a blessing after years of failed fertility treatments and frustrated adoption attempts. From the very first moment, he became the center of our world. Every laugh, every skinned knee, every nightmare, we were there for him. Andrew taught him how to swim, how to ride a bike. I read to him every word of every Harry Potter book before bedtime. A tremor passed through her perfectly modulated voice, and for the first time, genuine emotion slipped past the impeccable facade. He calls us Mommy and Daddy. He knows no others in those roles. When he's feverish, it's my name he calls. When he's scared during storms, it's Andrew's bed he runs to. Dr. Harrison Phillips, child psychologist recruited by the Blackwell defense, presented himself as the voice of scientific reason, his testimony laden with the authority of decades of clinical practice and academic publications. By the age of 8, the primary attachment bonds are already deeply established, he explained with the confidence of one who does not expect to be challenged. Removing a child from their family environment at this critical age can cause post-traumatic stress disorder, severe separation anxiety, behavioral regression, and potentially permanent damage to their ability to form healthy bonds in the future. Michael, or Gabriel if you prefer, has no conscious memories of his life with Mrs. Martinez. For all psychological purposes, the Blackwells are his parents. He made a significant pause, looking directly at the judge. The science of child psychology is clear. Continuity of care and environmental stability often supersede biological considerations when it comes to the psychological well-being of the child. After 3 weeks of exhaustive testimony, the New York County Family Court had become an emotional minefield. Journalists clustered in the marble hallways, catching glimpses of the central figures in what some newspapers called the modern Solomon case, a biblical reference that made Caroline Dawson roll her eyes every time she heard it. Courtroom 10, reserved for the final deliberations, was overflowing with spectators, curious lawyers, furiously note-taking law students, activists from both sides of the dispute. The case had divided not only the legal community, but the city of New York itself. In coffee shops, crowded subways, living rooms, ordinary people passionately debated. What was more important, biological rights or psychological stability? The mother who had her child stolen, or the family who inadvertently built their lives upon that tragedy? Public opinion swung like a pendulum, alternating between compassion for Julia and concern for the child's psychological well-being, as experts from all fields offered their analyses on the morning talk shows. "I believe the judge will announce his decision tomorrow," Caroline whispered to Julia, as they both watched the court clerk organize documents on the magistrate's bench. Julia's face had acquired an almost translucent pallor over the past few weeks, her cheeks sunken from stress and sleepless nights. "What do you think?" she asked, her voice so low that Caroline had to lean in to hear. "Honestly?" The lawyer hesitated, weighing her words carefully. "It's very divided. Abernathy is under tremendous pressure. The precedent he sets will affect similar cases for decades. On one hand, the DNA is incontestable, and compelling evidence was presented that the Blackwells should have suspected the illegality of the adoption. On the other hand, she did not complete the sentence, but she did not need to. They had both heard the testimonies of the child development experts, the detailed descriptions of potential separation traumas, the argument that at 8 years old, psychological well-being could outweigh biological considerations. On the other side of the courtroom, Eleanor Blackwell kept her eyes fixed on a distant point, her aristocratic profile like a marble statue. Andrew, in contrast, could not hide his anxiety, his fingers drumming incessantly against the polished wooden table. Between them, the invisible ghost of the child absent from the hearings, protected from the media circus by court order, remaining in the Blackwells' temporary custody with supervised visits for Julia, a boy who at this very moment was likely in his piano lesson or playing baseball in the backyard, unaware that dozens of adults were fervently debating his fate in an imposing building in downtown Manhattan. Judge Abernathy entered the courtroom, his grave countenance bearing the weight of an impossible decision. "After careful consideration of all testimony and evidence," he announced, adjusting his glasses, "this court will render its final decision tomorrow at 10 o'clock in the morning. I ask all involved to prepare the child regardless of the outcome." The Harrington mansion, normally a sanctuary of perfectly controlled order and elegance, reverberated with the unusual sound of doors being flung open and drawers yanked. Ryan, locked in his third-floor study, moved frenetically between the computer, the personal file cabinet, and the now-lit ornamental fireplace despite the afternoon heat. His face, once the image of carefree arrogance, was transformed by panic, eyes wide and bloodshot, brow beaded with sweat, lips dry from nervous licking. The news had broken that morning on all local channels and now dominated social media. Missing son found after 5 years through chance ballgame appearance. The details were imprecise, but chilling enough to send waves of terror down Ryan's spine. They mentioned an influential family who had illegally adopted the child, and worse, cited an ongoing criminal investigation to identify all those responsible for the kidnapping. The now shredded newspaper lying on the floor contained the phrase that had triggered his panic attack. "Police sources indicate intermediaries in the abduction are cooperating in exchange for reduced sentences. They're going to talk," he muttered repeatedly as he fed the fireplace with incriminating documents. Receipts for cash withdrawals to pay Vanessa and Kevin, notes about Margaret Thompson and Gabriel's routine, the disposable phone number used to contact the Blackwells. The flames devoured the evidence, turning it into ashes that drifted up the chimney, while the laptop beside him ran secure erasure programs, permanently deleting emails, messages, and browsing histories. His racing mind frantically calculated how much time he had before the police came knocking at his door. Vanessa and Kevin didn't know him by his real name. He'd been careful about that. But how long until the investigation traced the cash payments? Or until someone remembered that the housekeeper whose son went missing worked for his very family? The reach of potential connections expanded like a web in Ryan's mind, each thread leading inexorably back to him. The computer screen flashed with a notification of a live report. Trembling fingers clicked the link to reveal the reporter in front of the courthouse, microphoning Detective Walsh. "We have reason to believe this kidnapping was meticulously planned by someone close to the victim, someone with knowledge of the child's routine," the detective stated, his face impassive as he unconsciously detonated Ryan's last vestige of self-control. Close to the victim. The phrase echoed in Ryan's mind like a funeral bell. He was done for. He needed to flee, now, immediately, before it was too late. His parents were traveling, which gave him a small advantage. With agitated movements, he began emptying the sock drawer, stuffing a backpack with a few essential belongings and all the money he kept hidden in his room, little more than $4,000, a paltry sum considering the crime he had committed and the privileged life he had led. "Ryan, is everything okay up there?" The housekeeper's voice echoed up the staircase, causing him to freeze momentarily. "I'm fine, just organizing some papers," he replied, struggling to keep his voice steady as he zipped up his backpack. His plan was forming in fits and starts. He would drive to Pennsylvania today, ditch the car in some anonymous parking lot, take a bus heading west, change his name, his appearance, start over in some small town where no one would ever find him. Part of him knew it was a desperate plan, riddled with obvious flaws, but panic left no room for rational thought. As he carefully opened the study door, peering out into the empty hallway before heading for the back staircase, one certainty consumed his mind. He couldn't be in New York tomorrow when the judge announced the decision and the criminal investigation moved to its next phase. He needed to disappear like the ashes of his crimes, now floating invisibly through the air of the Harringtons' elegant mansion. As Ryan frantically drove along Interstate 80 toward Pennsylvania, the radio off to avoid any possible news about the case, Detective Walsh and his team meticulously combed through his financial life over the past 5 years. The coffee-saturated office, lit by the bluish glow of multiple computer screens at the New York Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit, buzzed with unusual activity for a Saturday night. Investigators advanced their digital search with the precision of archaeologists unearthing artifacts, each new discovery shedding light on another aspect of the crime. Carefully recovered bank records revealed a suspicious pattern. Exactly 3 days before Gabriel's disappearance, Ryan Harrington had withdrawn $75,000 from his investment account, citing a real estate opportunity that never materialized. Even more revealing, 2 withdrawals of $5,000 each were made for the kidnapping, moves that, when traced, led to Vanessa Monroe and Kevin Donovan, the 2 accomplices now cooperating with the investigation in exchange for reduced sentences. "Oh, we've got him," Walsh muttered, fatigue momentarily forgotten as he contemplated the computer screen displaying a sequence of recovered text messages between Ryan and a contact identified only as AB, initials that perfectly matched Andrew Blackwell. The content, though carefully coded, became incriminating in context. Merchandise delivered successfully. Final transfer as agreed, followed by confirmations of deposits into an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. Walsh grabbed his phone and dialed quickly. "We need an arrest warrant for Ryan Harrington immediately. And activate the interstate lookout for all patrols. He's on the run." As the team mobilized around him, Walsh felt a strange weight in his chest. It wasn't just professional satisfaction at solving a case, but a visceral understanding of what this privileged young man had stolen from a working mother. 5 unrecoverable years. Precious moments Julia Martinez would never get back, even with justice finally being served. 200 miles west near Bloomsburg, Pennsylvania, Ryan yawned at the wheel, fighting fatigue and the effects of the 2 Xanax pills he'd swallowed to calm his frayed nerves. The silver BMW maintained a steady speed, just a few miles under the limit to avoid attracting unwanted attention. He was so focused on staying awake that he didn't immediately notice the flashing blue and red lights in his rearview mirror. When he finally registered the presence of the police cruiser, his stomach plummeted as if the car had suddenly dropped into an abyss. He pulled over onto the shoulder, fingers drumming nervously on the steering wheel as he watched the state trooper slowly approach. "Good evening, sir. Vehicle registration and license, please," the officer requested, a flashlight illuminating the car's interior, revealing the backpack on the passenger seat and Ryan's pale, sweaty face. "Is there a problem, officer?" Ryan tried to smile, his voice betraying the panic he tried to hide. "Mr. Harrington," the officer began, his tone shifting subtly as he checked the documents, "I need you to turn off the vehicle and place your hands where I can see them." The change in the officer's demeanor was instant. A step backward, trained eyes assessing every minuscule movement, right hand discreetly moving closer to his holster. The cruiser's headlights cast elongated shadows across the uneven asphalt, etching Ryan's tense outline as he swallowed hard, feeling the weight of fate collapsing upon him. "There is an alert out for your detainment issued by the state of New York," the officer continued, his voice firm but unhurried. "Additional units are en route. Cooperate, and this will go easier." The world seemed to slow as Ryan realized his nightmare was taking shape. The ashes he'd left behind hadn't been enough to erase his trail. The money hadn't been enough to buy his freedom, and now, on the side of a dark Pennsylvania road, his privilege had finally met its limits. The red and blue lights flashed like a warning of the inevitable. As the metal handcuffs clicked shut around his wrists with a definitive clack, Ryan Harrington, promising heir, compulsive gambler, and now fugitive criminal, understood he would never escape the consequences of turning a child into merchandise to settle his own debts. The news of Ryan Harrington's arrest swept through the courtroom like a bolt of lightning, instantly transforming the atmosphere in the room, where, in less than 15 minutes, Judge Abernathy would announce his final decision. Julia, sitting rigidly beside Caroline Dawson, absorbed the information with a complex expression that blended vindication and a profound sadness for all that had been stolen from her. The murmur that ran through the gallery of spectators was quickly silenced by the court officer, but the glances cast towards the Blackwells became even more intense, laden with renewed judgment. Andrew Blackwell kept his gaze fixed on the floor, his previously confident posture now crumbled like a sandcastle struck by the tide. Helena, on the other hand, sat even straighter, her face a perfect mask of aristocratic composure that only the reddened eyes and the slight tremor at the corner of her lips betrayed. Lawrence Hoffman, the Blackwells' lawyer, furiously scribbled on his notepad, probably completely reformulating his final strategy in the face of this new and devastating information. "They knew," a woman whispered in the row behind Julia, her voice barely contained. "They had to know the child was stolen. Who pays for a private adoption without properly vetting the agency?" The answer came equally whispered from her companion. "Desperate people for a child who believe money can buy anything, even a family." Caroline gently squeezed Julia's arm, a silent gesture to ignore the comments around her and remain focused. The lawyer knew the revelation about Ryan and his direct connection to the case greatly strengthened her client's position, but also understood that child custody law was complex. Factors such as the child's psychological well-being would still weigh significantly in the judge's decision, regardless of any party's criminal culpability. The delicate scales of justice could tip either way, and at this moment 8 lives hung in the balance: Julia, Gabriel or Michael, the Blackwells, and indirectly Ryan, Margaret, and even Ryan's parents, who now saw their name dragged through the mud. The final minutes before the decision stretched like hours. The courtroom, once filled with nervous murmurs, now hung suspended in an almost suffocating anticipation. The heavy air carried the subtle scent of aged paper, mixed with the faint perfume of lawyers and prosecutors, maintaining inscrutable expressions. The wall clock seemed to move in slow motion, each tick reverberating in Julia's ears like a distant drum. Her fingers, clenched on the table before her, trembled slightly. The room was warm, but a chill ran down her spine. She closed her eyes momentarily, picturing Gabriel's face as she had last seen it 5 years ago, so small, so fragile, nestled in her arms. Then, the image was overlaid by the unexpected glimpse on television during the baseball game. The features had changed, but the look was the same. A lump formed in her throat. So many lost moments, so many birthdays, first days of school, fallen baby teeth, nighttime terrors, morning giggles. A chasm of absence no court decision could truly fill. The sudden hush that fell over the room snapped Julia from her thoughts. Judge Abernathy emerged from his chambers, his grave face bearing the weight of the decision that was about to irrevocably alter the course of multiple lives. His gaze swept the room, appraising each of those present before settling into his imposing chair. "All rise," announced the court officer, and the sound of chairs scraping echoed like a muffled thunderclap. Julia felt her heart hammer against her chest as she stood, her legs suddenly heavy. Gabriel's fate, suspended between two worlds, two homes, two families, would finally be sealed by the words the magistrate was about to utter. After careful consideration of all testimony, evidence, and expert reports, this court hereby determines that legal custody of Gabriel Martinez, currently known as Michael Blackwell, shall be returned to his biological mother, Julia Martinez. Judge Abernathy's words rippled across the courtroom like a seismic wave, triggering instantaneous reactions that seemed to occur in slow motion. Julia brought her hands to her face, her knees buckling as Caroline steadied her, silent tears streaming through her trembling fingers. 5 years of despair, fruitless searches, and dying hope culminated in this moment of utter validation that left her breathless, as if resurfacing from a long drowning. Her entire body shook with an emotion so overpowering it transcended mere joy. It was redemption, rebirth, an entire world of restored possibilities she had believed lost forever. The whisper that escaped her lips, my son, it was a prayer, a thank you, a renewed promise. On the other side of the room, Eleanor Blackwell let out a shrill, visceral sound, a primal wail of loss that seemed to come from the depths of her soul. Her aristocratic features crumbled like a broken mask, revealing the raw expression of a woman facing the unthinkable, the loss of a child she had truly loved, even if his arrival had been built on lies she could no longer deny. Andrew tried to reach for her, but she recoiled from his touch as if he were a stranger, her face momentarily contorted into something akin to hatred, for him, for Ryan, for the decisions that had led to this devastating moment. Attorney Hoffman was already on his feet, automatically uttering the words about the possibility of appeal, but the Blackwells hardly seemed to hear him, lost in the immediate reality of their world crumbling. The cameras of the journalists captured every nuance of this human drama unfolding, each facial expression becoming part of a narrative that would dominate the evening news broadcasts. This court recognizes the emotional complexity of this transition, Judge Abernathy continued, his voice steady but not devoid of compassion, and therefore orders a 30-day transition period during which supervised family therapy sessions will be conducted to minimize psychological trauma to the child. After this period, full custody will transfer to Ms. Martinez, with the possibility of limited, supervised visitation for the Blackwells to be re-evaluated after 6 months. He paused, adjusting his glasses before proceeding with the more severe part of his ruling. Additionally, in light of the evidence presented by the prosecution regarding prior knowledge of the adoption's illegality, this court hereby remands the Blackwell case to the New York State Criminal Court, where they will face charges of document fraud, obstruction of justice, and possible accessory to kidnapping. Bail is set at $1 million each, with the immediate surrender of their passports and a prohibition on leaving the state. Julia did not fully register the legal implications being announced. Her mind was fixed on the only reality that mattered: Gabriel would come home. The walls she had built around her heart, the protections needed to survive day after day without completely breaking down, were beginning to crumble. Caroline squeezed her hand tightly, anchoring her in the present moment as she whispered, "We made it, Julia. He's coming back to you." Through the blurred vision, Julia saw Eleanor being supported by an assistant as she was led out of the room, her elegant body now hunched by the weight of loss. For a brief and surprising moment, Julia felt a pang of compassion for the woman, not for the fraud she had committed, but for the genuine pain she now felt. In the midst of this storm of conflicting emotions, a single thought crystallized with absolute clarity. In less than a month, she would embrace her son again. She would touch his hair, hear his voice, learn who he had become in those lost years. "When can I see him?" Julia asked Caroline, her voice trembling but determined, ignoring the tumult around her as journalists rushed to report the decision and onlookers commented in exalted voices. The courtroom was a controlled chaos. Camera flashes exploded without warning, voices overlapped in a constant murmur, and the hurried footsteps of reporters echoed across the polished marble floor. The air carried a mixture of the expensive perfume of the lawyers, sweat from accumulated tension, and the slightly sweetish smell of the waxed wooden benches. But for Julia, all of that was just distant noise. Nothing else mattered beyond the answer she awaited. Caroline smiled, her eyes misting over as they reflected the intensity of the moment she was witnessing. Even as a professional accustomed to dealing with difficult cases, she couldn't contain her emotion as she saw the woman before her, exhausted but with a glow of renewed hope. "The first supervised session is scheduled for tomorrow at 10 o'clock, she said, her voice soft as if she wanted to calm the silent storm inside Julia. "He will know who you are before you meet." Julia let out a ragged sigh, her chest rising and falling erratically. Tomorrow, after 1,825 days of absence, in less than 24 hours, she would be in her son's presence once again. The magnitude of that thought was overwhelming. Her legs faltered, and Caroline, sensing her state, gently grasped her arm. "Are you all right?" she asked, her concern sincere. Julia nodded, but her throat was tight, and the words took a moment to come out. "It's just hard to believe this day has finally come," she admitted, with a hesitant smile between the tears. "I don't know what it will be like. What if he doesn't recognize me? What if he doesn't want to see me?" Caroline gave her hand a gentle squeeze, a firm and reassuring gesture. "He's a child, Julia. 5 years without you. Don't erase the love he felt in the first 3. It takes time, but he deserves to know who you are, and you deserve to have him back." Julia closed her eyes for a moment, absorbing those words like a balm for her wounds. When she opened them again, the glow in her eyes was different. There was fear, yes, but there was also something stronger, the determination of a mother who never gave up. "So tomorrow," she whispered, as if making a promise to fate itself. "Yes," Caroline confirmed. "Tomorrow you'll see him." The family therapy room at the New York Child Wellness Center had been meticulously designed to convey safety and comfort. Soothing shades of blue on the walls, furniture scaled appropriately for both adults and children, a discreet therapeutic sandbox in the corner, and carefully selected toys on the low shelves. Julia had been sitting on the central sofa for 20 minutes, even though she had arrived an hour early, unable to risk any delay. For this moment she had awaited for a stretch of time that seemed to extend beyond the conventional measure of years itself. Her fingers smoothed repeatedly over the simple but new dress she had bought, especially for the occasion, as the therapist, Dr. Bennett, once again explained how the session would be conducted. The words barely registered in her mind. All she could process was the imminence of the encounter, the near incomprehensible reality that, in moments, the door would open and Gabriel would walk in. No longer the 3-year-old boy of her frozen memories, but an 8-year-old child who had lived an entire life away from her, a life she had not been part of, filled with people, experiences, and memories that did not include her face or her voice. "Remember, Julia," Dr. Bennett's gentle but firm voice penetrated her emotional haze. "He is confused and scared. Until yesterday, he only knew one truth about who he is and whom he belongs to. Today, he is being introduced to an entirely new reality. We need to respect his pace, his questions, even his resistance." Julia nodded automatically, but inside, a primal fear grew. What if he rejected her? What if he hated her for disrupting the only world he knew? What if the bond she believed transcended time and separation simply no longer existed for him? Her reflections were interrupted by the soft sound of voices approaching in the hallway, small hesitant footsteps mingled with more confident adult ones. The air around her seemed to crystallize, every molecule of oxygen suddenly precious and insufficient. The doorknob turned slowly, and there, framed by the doorway, was Gabriel, taller than she had imagined, his dark hair neatly combed, wearing jeans and a blue t-shirt with a dinosaur printed on it. The crescent moon-shaped birthmark on his right temple, now partially obscured by a lock of hair, was like an ancient sign the universe had placed there so she could always recognize him, no matter how much time passed. The boy paused at the entrance, his expression a complex blend of curiosity, apprehension, and something Julia couldn't quite name. Perhaps an instinctive recognition he himself did not understand. His dark eyes, so similar to her own, studied her intently, as if trying to fit a piece into a puzzle whose final image he could not yet visualize. The social worker accompanying him gently guided him into the room, introducing him to Dr. Bennett before discreetly withdrawing to the adjacent observation room. Gabriel remained standing, his small fingers clutching the hem of his shirt in a nervous gesture that made Julia's heart clench. At 3 years old, he had done exactly the same motion when anxious, a continuity of behavior that had somehow survived the separation. Dr. Bennett approached him, bending down to meet his eyes. "Gabriel, this is Julia. She is the special person we talked about." Julia tried to smile, but her lips were trembling too much to form any coherent expression. She wanted to run to him, hug him, cover his face with kisses, tell him 1,000 times that she loved him, that she had never stopped looking for him, that every day without him had been an unbearable torture. But she remained seated, respecting the space he needed in this first impossible encounter. "Hello, Gabriel," she finally managed to say, her voice steadier than she expected. The boy studied her for a few more moments before taking a small step toward her. Something in his eyes changed, not full recognition, but a more intense curiosity, as if some distant echo was being evoked in his consciousness. "Why are you crying?" he asked, his childlike voice sending waves of emotion through Julia's body. She hadn't even noticed the tears that were now freely flowing down her face. "Because I'm really happy to see you," she replied, sincere in every syllable. Gabriel tilted his head slightly, processing this information as only children can, with a direct acceptance that adults have long forgotten. He took another step towards her, now separated by only a few meters that seemed to contain entire universes. The question that followed was simple in its phrasing, but complex in all its layers of meaning and consequence. "Are you my mother?" The words hung in the air like particles of light, transforming the atmosphere of the room. Julia felt time slow down, each beat of her heart marking an eternity between the question and her answer. With tears in her eyes, but with the absolute certainty of one who has finally found their way back home after an impossible journey, she simply replied, "I've always been." Julia's words lingered in the air like notes of a long-forgotten, but never truly lost song. Gabriel's eyes, so similar to hers, locked onto Julia's with an intensity that seemed to transcend the time and space that had separated them. Something deep and primal was happening in the silence that followed, neural connections firing in recognition, pre-verbal memories emerging from the depths of the infant consciousness, bonds that had been formed in the first and most crucial 3 years of life, claiming their place in the present. Dr. Bennett watched in respectful silence, understanding that she was witnessing something rare and sacred, that inexplicable moment when the heart recognizes what the rational mind still cannot fully comprehend. Gabriel frowned slightly, a small crease forming between his dark eyebrows, as if trying to solve an invisible riddle. "I dream about you," he finally said, his small voice clear in the silence of the room. "There's a woman who sings to me when I'm asleep. She smells like flowers after the rain." His words hit Julia like physical waves, each one washing away another fragment of the barrier she had built around her heart to survive. The perfume she had worn during Gabriel's early years, a simple jasmine fragrance she had bought on sale, she had never used again after he disappeared, unable to bear any sensory reminder that would transport her back to the time when he was safe in her arms. And the song she sang every night, a Guatemalan melody that her own mother had sung to her, passed down through generations as an audible legacy of maternal love. How could he remember that? What memories had survived, buried deep in his subconscious, waiting only for this moment to resurface? "Do you want to hear the song?" she asked softly, her heart racing with equal parts fear and hope. Gabriel nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. With a trembling voice that gradually gained strength, Julia began to sing the melody that had lulled hundreds of her son's nights in his early years. "A la puerta del cielo." The notes floated around them like luminous butterflies, weaving a cocoon of shared memory. Gabriel's eyes widened in recognition, and something broke inside him, an invisible dam holding emotions and memories he didn't even know he possessed. Without warning or hesitation, he crossed the space between them and threw himself into Julia's arms. His small arms wrapped around her neck, with the desperate strength of someone clinging to a lifeline in turbulent waters. His face pressed against her shoulder, his small body shaking with sobs that seemed to come from some ancestral and nameless place. 3 months after the court ruling, Julia's small Bronx apartment overflowed with an almost palpable happiness that seemed to illuminate even its most worn corners. The newly painted soft yellow walls now harbored not just frozen memories, but a life in full motion, resurrected from the limbo of absence that had imprisoned it for so long. The transition had not been without challenges. The first few weeks brought nighttime terrors, moments of confusion and difficult questions to answer. Gabriel alternated between periods of surprisingly fluid adaptation and episodes of silent withdrawal, processing in his childlike way the complex reality of his story. Therapy sessions continued, helping mother and son navigate an emotional territory for which there were no precise maps. But each day brought small victories, moments of connection that gradually accumulated, stitching back together a relationship that had been violently torn apart. Gabriel's laughter, initially rare and restrained, now echoed through the apartment with increasing frequency, filling spaces that had remained empty for too long. On that Sunday morning, as she prepared pancakes, the breakfast she had discovered to be Gabriel's favorite, Julia watched her son, sitting at the small kitchen table, focused on a drawing he was making with crayons. His face, so similar to her own, bore the peculiar seriousness of children absorbed in artistic creation, his tongue slightly sticking out in utter concentration. When he held up the paper to show his work, Julia felt the air escape her lungs. There, in colorful, imprecise strokes, was the drawing of 3 figures: a dark-haired, curly woman holding the hand of a small boy, and beside them, an elderly white-haired woman. "This is me," Gabriel explained, pointing at the central figure. "That's you and that's Grandma Maggie. She's coming to visit us today, right?" The mention of Margaret, who after weeks of Julia's insistence had finally agreed to visit, made her heart clench slightly. The elderly woman, devastated by the guilt of Gabriel's abduction, had isolated herself in her small apartment, initially refusing to be part of Gabriel's reconstructed life, believing she did not deserve forgiveness. "Yes, she's coming," Julia confirmed, placing a plate of pancakes in front of her son. "You like her, don't you?" Gabriel nodded emphatically, his mouth already full, eyes shining with anticipation. "She told the best stories," he said after swallowing. "Stories about warrior princesses and dragons that ate ice cream, not like the stories from the other house." That's how he referred to the Blackwells and the 5 years spent with them. The other house, a way of compartmentalizing that part of his life while building something new. Julia sat beside him, allowing herself the simple pleasure of watching her son eat, each movement, each expression representing a daily little miracle she would never take for granted again. "Mom," Gabriel suddenly said, the word emerging naturally from his lips for the first time without hesitation or awareness of the milestone it represented. "Can we take Grandma Maggie for ice cream later?" The world seemed to freeze for an instant. That single word, so common for most mothers, sounded to Julia's ears like the most beautiful symphony ever composed. Silent tears streamed down her face as she smiled, unable to respond immediately. Gabriel looked at her confused, not understanding the emotional depth of the moment he had just created. "Why are you crying? Don't you like ice cream?" Julia laughed through her tears, pulling him into a hug that contained 5 years of missed hugs. "I love ice cream, and I love hearing you call me Mom." Gabriel shrugged, as if he didn't understand why something so obvious could elicit such a reaction. "But you are my mom. You always were, remember?" His own words returned to her, coated in childlike acceptance, were the most precious gift she could imagine. The doorbell rang precisely at 2 o'clock. Margaret Thompson stood outside, her frail body looking even smaller under the weight of anxiety and remorse. When Julia opened the door, the elderly woman couldn't find her voice initially, tears already flooding her tired eyes. "Julia, she began, but was interrupted by Gabriel running through the room and hugging her legs with childlike enthusiasm. "Grandma Maggie, you came. Mom said we can have ice cream." The surprise on the old woman's face at hearing Gabriel call Julia Mom transformed into a complex emotion, blending joy and pain. "I'm so sorry for everything," she whispered to Julia over the boy's head. Julia reached out, taking the wrinkled fingers of the woman who, despite the terrible mistake she had made, also loved Gabriel. "We are starting over. All of us," she simply replied, forgiveness flowing not from moral obligation, but from the deep understanding that love for Gabriel was the only bond that mattered now. That same week, nearly 50 kilometers away, the New York State Criminal Court closed another chapter of that story when Judge Henderson pronounced the sentence. The imposing courtroom was illuminated by large frosted glass windows, where the cold winter light cast long shadows across the gray carpet. The air carried a mixture of varnished wood and the faint perfume of well-dressed lawyers. In the galleries, the murmurs ceased when the wooden gavel struck the lectern. "Ryan Harrington, this court finds you guilty of conspiracy to kidnap, child trafficking, and fraud. The premeditated and cruel nature of your crimes, motivated by greed and self-preservation at the expense of an innocent child and his mother, warrants the maximum punishment allowed by law. I sentence you to 25 years in prison with no possibility of parole before 15 years served." The judge's deep voice reverberated off the mahogany-paneled walls. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. With each word, Ryan's shoulders sank a little lower. For an instant, it seemed he might contest, that his lawyer would whisper one last strategy, but nothing came. His once arrogant face was now an empty mask of defeat. His gaze drifted into the void as the officers approached to lead him back to his cell. Camera flashes snapped like muffled thunderclaps, capturing the end of a man's story who once had the world in his hands. In the back rows of the courtroom, William and Sarah Harrington sat rigid, their faces aged to stone by public scandal. The weight of an irrefutable truth crushed them. They had created a monster. Sarah clutched a white linen handkerchief, but not to catch tears. Her face was dry, expressionless. Only her fingers, clenched in the fabric, betrayed a tremor held within. William took a deep breath before rising, his voice ringing clear and controlled, even as his eyes betrayed the burden of shame. "Our son is dead to us. Any fortune he would have inherited will be donated entirely to organizations that combat child trafficking and support families of missing children." The words fell heavy in the courtroom, leaving the air thick with shock and hushed murmurs. Ryan turned his head slightly, as if he wanted to face them one last time, but his parents were already looking ahead, distant. The rattle of handcuffs echoed through the chamber as the guards pulled him away, taking with them a once powerful name, now reduced to a prison number. At night, after Margaret left and Gabriel fell asleep in his new bed, decorated with fluorescent stars on the ceiling and a growing collection of plush dinosaurs, Julia sat on the small balcony of the apartment, contemplating the city that continued its frantic pace below. In her hands, she held the photograph of 3-year-old Gabriel that she had carried as a talisman during the years of searching. Next to it, she placed a new one, 8-year-old Gabriel, smiling beside the Tyrannosaurus Rex-shaped cake she had made to celebrate their first month together again. She traced with her fingers the contours of both faces, the changes and the permanences, marveling at the unlikely miracle that had happened. The future still held challenges. There were scars in both of them that time could soften but never completely erase. There was the judicial system to navigate to ensure that the Blackwells could never again claim any right over Gabriel. There were years of therapy ahead to help the boy integrate his two lives into a coherent narrative that would not destroy him. But there were also promises, possibilities that once seemed lost forever. Julia closed her eyes, allowing herself to fully feel the gratitude that overflowed from her being. Through the half-open window of the room, she could hear Gabriel's soft and rhythmic breathing, the most precious sound in the universe. At some point, she would need to get up, go in, check on him as she did several times a night, still disbelieving that it was not an elaborate dream from which she would wake again to the pain of absence. But for now, she allowed herself to merely exist in this perfect moment, holding the two photographs against her heart, whispering the words she once believed she could never say again: "We will never be separated again." Did you like Julia and Gabriel's story? Then subscribe to the channel, leave your like, and check out the next one waiting for you here on screen. I'll see you there.